A deformed body, unbearable pain, an odor so foul it made courtiers faint. After death, his rotting corpse leaked fluids from the coffin, which stray dogs lapped up off the floor. This was the gruesome end of one of history's most feared monarchs. Today, we're uncovering the true story of the death of King Henry VIII of England, a tale so grotesque that it's rarely told in full detail. Brace yourself, because this dark story isn't for the squeamish. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491. At just 17 years old, he ascended to the English throne and was hailed as Europe's most handsome prince. He stood over 6 feet tall, athletic and vibrant, with thick golden red hair and a commanding presence. Contemporaries were in awe of the young Henry. One Venetian ambassador gushed that Henry had an extraordinary physique and an almost angelic face, surpassing all other princes of Christendom in looks and charm. He seemed to have it all: strength, intelligence, charisma, the very image of a virile Renaissance king. So, how did this picture of health and power end up dying such a degrading, horrific death? The downfall of Henry VIII began with a single, devastating event. The turning point came in January 1536 during a jousting tournament at Greenwich. Henry, then 44 years old, decided to compete as he had in his youth. But this time, disaster struck. The king was thrown from his horse, and the massive animal collapsed onto him. Henry was knocked unconscious for 2 hours, and those nearby feared the worst. He did eventually wake up and survive the accident, but he was badly hurt, especially his right leg. That leg injury never healed properly. The wound festered and transformed into a chronic, open ulcer that would torment Henry for the rest of his life. It oozed pus constantly and reeked so badly that people said you could smell the king coming even before he entered a room. For a man as proud and vain as Henry, this was a crushing humiliation. He had once been the dazzling young monarch whom everyone admired. Now he was literally rotting alive, and everyone at court knew it. Courtiers had no choice but to endure the stench without reacting. Showing disgust could mean incurring the wrath of the king. Interestingly, this accident in 1536 coincided with a dark turn in Henry's behavior. Not long after his injury, Henry ordered the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, based on flimsy and fabricated charges of adultery and treason. Some historians speculate that Henry's head injury from the joust might have damaged his brain and worsened his temper and paranoia. The once charming king grew irritable, suspicious, and prone to fits of rage. Whether or not the injury changed his personality, Henry VIII was never the same man after 1536, physically or mentally. With his leg wound and declining mobility, Henry's body began to fall apart. Unable to exercise as he used to, he started packing on weight at a startling rate. His once trim waist of about 89 centimeters, 35 inches, ballooned to over 130 centimeters, more than 50 inches. By his late 40s, Henry weighed roughly 180 kilograms, around 400 pounds. He had become so obese that special measures were needed to accommodate him. Servants reportedly had to carry the bloated king using a custom-made pulley or hoist system to move him between floors of his palaces. Some doorways even had to be widened to fit his enormous frame. The mighty Henry VIII, who in his youth could joust and dance for hours, was now crippled by his own weight, carried about like an unwieldy piece of furniture. Henry's gluttonous diet only accelerated his deterioration. As king, he feasted like a king. Historical records show he consumed around 5,000 calories a day, mostly in the form of rich red meats and heavy dishes, with hardly any vegetables or fruits. A light supper for Henry might include several types of meat pie, roasted game hens, and thick slabs of beef, all washed down with copious amounts of ale and wine. This indulgent diet, coupled with his forced inactivity, turned the once muscular athlete into a morbidly obese invalid. Henry's health issues compounded one another. His weight gain likely led to type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, though doctors of the time didn't know those terms. What they could see were the outward symptoms: the ever-worsening ulcers on his legs, his throbbing joint pains, and his shortness of breath. As Henry's leg ulcers worsened, the medical treatments of the 16th century only made things more nightmarish. The king's physicians were desperate to heal their monarch, but their remedies were as gruesome as the disease. They tried cauterizing the ulcers with red-hot irons, literally burning the flesh to seal wounds. They applied poultices and ointments laced with arsenic and mercury, toxic substances that likely poisoned Henry slowly. And, following the medical thinking of the day, they performed frequent bloodletting, draining the king's blood with leeches or cuts, hoping to rebalance his humors. Of course, these treatments did nothing to cure Henry's ulcer. They only weakened him further and likely worsened the infections. The wounds on his legs became so deep and gangrenous that chunks of decaying flesh would slough off, and observers claimed you could even see bone through the open sores. The smell that wafted from Henry's diseased legs was so revolting that it overpowered entire rooms. It's said you could detect the king's rotting flesh from 3 chambers away, yet no one dared flinch or complain in his presence. Henry's declining health did not stop him from pursuing his desires, especially when it came to young women at court. Astonishingly, at age 49, when he was severely overweight, diseased, and foul-smelling, Henry took a 5th wife, the teenager Catherine Howard, who was just 19. Henry saw Catherine Howard as a vivacious beauty who could make him feel young again. He doted on her and even called her his rose without a thorn. But in truth, their marriage was a grotesque spectacle. Imagine the scene: an ailing, obese 50-year-old king with a festering leg wound, trying to play the gallant husband to a girl 30 years his junior. Courtiers had to pretend this was romantic, but everyone knew it was doomed. Catherine Howard was repulsed by her husband's deformities and smell. She sought affection elsewhere and began a secret affair with a young courtier. When Henry eventually learned of Catherine's infidelity, his old fury ignited. In 1542, he had the teenage queen executed for treason, along with the lover who had comforted her. The gruesome irony was not lost on anyone. Even as Henry's own body was betraying and decaying him, he couldn't tolerate the betrayal of a wife he'd subjected to such a horrific marriage. By the time Henry married his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, in 1543, he was a shell of the man he had been. That union was never about passion. It was more of a political arrangement, and perhaps a bit of companionship for an aging king. Catherine Parr was effectively Henry's nurse in his final years. She tended to his ulcerated legs, managed his medications, and tried to keep him comfortable. It's a testament to her patience, and perhaps fear, that Catherine Parr remained loyal and caring, given what happened to some of the wives before her. Henry, once a fiery lover, was now more patient in marriage only because he was too sick and tired to cause much trouble this time. Even as Henry's body deteriorated, his lust for power and control remained ferocious. In fact, his worsening health seemed to intensify the darker aspects of his personality. The court of Henry VIII in his final years was a place of fear and suspicion. The king's moods grew more volatile and dangerous than ever. His pain was constant and crippling, which often left him in a foul temper. Accounts from palace staff and courtiers describe how Henry would suffer explosive bouts of pain, where he'd scream obscenities and curse everyone around him. At other times, he'd sink into depressive silences, sitting motionless on his throne or bed for hours, staring into nothing. This once vibrant and sociable king now oscillated between agony and apathy. His paranoia also reached new heights. Henry started to see plots and betrayal everywhere. No one was safe from his suspicions. Not his oldest friends, not his top advisors, not even his own blood. One by one, he purged his court of those he imagined to be disloyal. Some were imprisoned, others executed, often on flimsy evidence or none at all. The slightest mistake could be fatal. Courtiers lived in terror that a casual comment or an unfortunate look might be interpreted as treason by the mercurial king. Notably, in December 1546, Henry ordered the arrest of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, who was actually a distant cousin of the king. The Earl of Surrey was a celebrated nobleman and warrior, but Henry's paranoid mind convinced him that Surrey was plotting to take the throne. Despite dubious charges, Surrey was beheaded for treason. And this happened just 9 days before Henry VIII's own death. It's chilling to think that even on the brink of his demise, Henry was still signing death warrants. Henry's fear of betrayal extended even to his food and drink. The king became obsessed with the idea of being poisoned by his enemies. a common fear for monarchs of the time, but Henry took it to extremes. He instituted rigorous safeguards for every meal. Servants and official tasters had to sample every dish and every goblet of wine before Henry touched them. The kitchen staff and cupbearers were kept under constant scrutiny. Utensils, plates, and cups were regularly inspected for any hint of poison. Of course, Henry had long used food tasters, but in his final years, this practice became almost an elaborate ritual of paranoia. Some historians have speculated that Henry's mental decline, possibly worsened by untreated diabetes or even small strokes, fueled this obsessive fear. Whatever the cause, it added another layer of misery to his final days. Henry was a man who trusted no one, not even those feeding him. As 1546 turned into 1547, it was clear to anyone near Henry that the end was approaching. Clear to everyone, that is, except those who valued their lives. By December 1546, King Henry VIII was a bedridden giant, skin marbled with infected sores, racked by fever and riddled with pain. He was only 55 years old, but decades of overindulgence and disease made him look far older. Henry's legs were in terrible shape. The ulcers had likely developed gangrene. The stench of rotting flesh never left his chambers, despite the herbs and incense burned to mask it. Breathing became a struggle for him, possibly due to heart failure or a series of infections overwhelming his body. In his final weeks, Henry drifted in and out of delirium. Servants and doctors reported that when the king was feverish and hallucinating, he would murmur and sometimes cry out names of those long dead. Jane Seymour's name was heard often. Jane was Henry's beloved third wife, who had died shortly after giving birth to his only son, Edward. Some even claimed Henry called out for Anne Boleyn, the wife he had executed, as if haunted by her memory or ghost. It was as if, in his dying moments, Henry was confronting the ghosts of his past, the wives, friends, and enemies who had fallen victim to his decisions. Yet, in a macabre twist of protocol, no one dared speak of the king's impending death. Under English law at the time, it was considered treason to predict or announce the monarch's death. So, even as Henry lay dying, with the smell of death literally hanging in the air, his physicians and courtiers kept up a grim charade. They continued to assure anyone who asked that the king would recover, that he just needed rest, that God willing he'd be on his feet soon. Imagine the atmosphere. The courtiers know the truth, but must nod and smile, pretending their king isn't a dying man. They had to plan for his death in secret, while publicly maintaining the fiction of his health. This morbid pretense went on until the very last moment. Finally, on the night of January 27th, 1547, it became impossible to deny that Henry's life was flickering out. The king, drifting in and out of consciousness, allowed Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to be sent for, a sign he knew the end was near. Cranmer rushed through the winter cold to Hampton Court Palace, but by the time he arrived, Henry was beyond speech. In those final hours, Henry VIII could only communicate by squeezing the Archbishop's hand. Cranmer asked the dying king if he trusted in Jesus Christ for salvation, and Henry gave a weak squeeze, his last conscious act. In the early hours of January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died. The larger-than-life ruler who had reigned for nearly 38 years was gone. He was 55 years old. Henry's death was hushed up at first, to manage the transition of power, but word soon spread that the tyrant was no more. One might think the king's suffering was over, but in an almost poetic stroke of horror, the indignity of Henry's story did not end with his last breath. Henry VIII in death was as troublesome as he was in life. Because of his enormous size, a regular coffin wouldn't suffice. Craftsmen hastily built an extra-large, reinforced coffin to hold his bloated corpse. The embalming practices of the time were primitive. Surgeons removed some of the internal organs and filled the body with spices, herbs, and preservatives as best they could, then wrapped and sealed the corpse. But Henry's body was in a dreadful state, and 3 weeks would pass between his death and burial, plenty of time for nature to run its course. The king's coffin, a huge lead-lined box, was sent on a slow procession to Windsor Castle, where Henry wished to be buried. On the way, the coffin rested overnight at Sion Abbey, about halfway to Windsor. And it was there, at Sion Abbey, that one of the most ghoulish legends of the Tudor age was born. In the stillness of that winter night, Henry VIII's corpse literally overflowed. The gases of decomposition built up inside the coffin until the sealed lid cracked open. By the time morning came, those attending the coffin were greeted with a stomach-churning sight and smell. Putrid bodily fluids had leaked out of the coffin and pooled onto the stone floor beneath. Even more horrifying, several stray dogs from the abbey grounds had crept in during the night. Drawn by the scent, the dogs were found licking up the vile liquid that had spilled from the king's coffin. When word of this spread, many were quick to see it as divine judgment or the fulfillment of a prophecy. Years earlier, a friar who opposed Henry's break from the Catholic Church had preached that dogs would lick the blood of a king as punishment for his sins, likening Henry to the biblical king Ahab, whose blood was licked by dogs according to Scripture. Now, it seemed that prophecy had come horrifically true. Whether by coincidence or not, the imagery was unforgettable. The mighty Henry VIII, who had called himself the supreme head of the church and trampled anyone who defied him, lay in death as a feast for scavenging dogs. It was a scene so frightful and humiliating that it gave even Henry's loyalists pause, and it thrilled his enemies who heard of it. After this gruesome incident, the coffin was resealed as best as possible. On February 16, 1547, nearly 3 weeks after his death, Henry VIII was finally laid to rest. Despite everything, the funeral was a majestic state ceremony, as grand as any for a king of England. Nobles, foreign dignitaries, and clergy gathered at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle for the service. They tried to maintain all the pomp and reverence due a monarch, even though an awful stench reportedly hung in the air from the coffin. Henry was buried in the chapel's vault, next to his third wife, Jane Seymour. Jane had been the only one of his 6 wives to bear him a surviving son, the future King Edward VI. Henry had chosen this burial arrangement long before his death, a last gesture of favor to Jane, whom he called his true love. Thus ended the life of Henry VIII, not with a glorious triumph, but with a grotesque whimper. The king who once bestrode his kingdom like a colossus was ultimately reduced to rotting flesh and posthumous embarrassment. His death marked the end of an era. Henry had reigned for nearly 4 decades, and in that time, he changed England forever, separating the country from the Roman Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England under his rule. This religious schism, along with his many marriages and political upheavals, defined the Tudor age and still echoes in British history today. But even as his political legacy endured, Henry's horrific demise showed the world that kings are as mortal as the rest of us. After Henry's death, his long-desired son, Edward VI, took the throne, but Edward was a sickly child. He ruled for only 6 years and died as a teenager, never fulfilling the grand hopes his father had for him. Following Edward, Henry's daughters from 2 of his doomed marriages each took a turn. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, became queen and attempted to reverse her father's Protestant reforms, earning the nickname Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. Then Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, ascended the throne and ushered in a golden age for England. In a twist of fate, it was Elizabeth, the daughter of the wife Henry executed in anger, who proved to be the greatest Tudor monarch of all, presiding over a flourishing of culture and power that Henry VIII could only dream of. Henry VIII's grotesque death offers a powerful lesson in humility. Here was a man who believed himself almost omnipotent. He declared himself head of the church, bent the law to his will, and thought nothing of executing those who displeased him. He lived in unprecedented luxury and dominated all around him. And yet, in the end, all that power could not save him from the ravages of disease and age. The image of King Henry, so magnificent in his youth, compared to the reality of Henry on his deathbed, obese, crippled, and miserable, is one of the great cautionary tales of history. It reminds us that absolute power and riches do not shield anyone from pain, madness, or death. Henry's life was a roller coaster of glory and tragedy, but his end was a sobering equalizer. The monarch who imagined himself above the laws of both man and God was ultimately brought low by the simple fact that he was human. All the pride, cruelty, and excess led him to a death that was undignified and lonely. Stripped of the crown and the silk robes, Henry VIII was just a man whose body failed him in the most gruesome way. The terrible death of Henry VIII continues to fascinate and horrify us because it peels back the layers of majesty and shows the raw humanity underneath. It's a story that proves even the mightiest of kings can fall, and when they do, the fall can be far uglier than we ever imagined. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating and chilling, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking tales from history. Remember, sometimes truth is stranger and darker than fiction. See you in the next story.